So we have to start. I make just 2 minutes introduction and then we will have the presentation. So this is a session on fuel poverty and the fuel poverty evaluation, since we are here in a conference on evaluation. And this is a topic which is not really well covered. So this is why we welcome all the participants. This is an important issue. There are more than 30 million of fuel poor in Europe, and in France we consider, depending on the definition, we are around 6 to 8 million of poor. So this is an important issue. Secondly, there is discussion on new provision on the EED on fuel poverty. So it means that the Commission has taken this issue seriously. And this is a good thing on definition monitoring. And there are several benchmarks which have been carried out this, let's say, recent years on energy efficiency policy. One from ADEME with Jean-Sébastien and myself, which cover around 10 European countries. There were one made by Enea from Italy, and ongoing one from the Club of Energy Efficiency, the ENR Club, managed by the Portuguese agency, which is, yes, they try to deploy policies in Portugal. What are the general main issues we are discussing in this area? About definition, what is the definition? And academics like to discuss 10 years about definition. But we understand this has an impact on the policy design, identification and localization of the poor, where they are, and the problem we face. We know we have data on income, we have data on energy, but for a different reason, it's difficult to match these two type of data set. Why the identification of localization is difficult. We have policies, and the game is you have people which are more in favor of social subsidies to give 100 or 200 euros through a voucher, or people who believe that we have to work on dedicated, specific policies on fuel poverty. The issue of national versus territories or regional or more local policies. What we have seen is there are many policies on residential, mainly on space heating, some study on the air conditioning, less research or policies on transportation, and not too much policy on the link how the renewables can contribute with energy efficiency on fuel poverty. We have the relationship with sufficiency. It's not obvious to see what is the exact relationship with this fuel poverty and sufficiency. And yes, the issue of inequity, how the policies, energy efficiency policies, can play a role to reduce inequalities. So this is the main, I think, discussion around fuel poverty and monitoring. And I think what we are working today will be part of this monitoring and the evaluation. Personally, I work in the French Observatory of Fuel Poverty in France. I was in charge of a working group on international, let's say, cooperation on fuel poverty. And and also in the Odyssey MURE project, we have part of the MURE database is dedicated to fuel poverty policy, and in the Odyssey database, we have a set of indicators tracking fuel poverty. So this is why I am more or less motivated to this topic, and I was happy to manage that one. But my, let's say, what I get from that, it's time to act. I like discussion, academic discussion on definition, localization, and so on, blah, 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 blah. I think we need policies. So this is more or less not my conclusion, but see, we have to act. We will have 3 presentations. We cover some aspect of the shopping list I have presented. First one, which is an article, Tailor-Made DSM, What Vulnerable Customers Need from Energy Efficiency Progress from Catherine Johnson. Second one, methodological challenge in qualitative energy poverty research from Miss Dubois, and energy affordability. So we will travel here from Europe, Australia, and US, I think. So this is a way to save CO2, but working at the international level. So I let the floor to our first speaker. So the rule is simple: 15 minutes. Okay. Plus question after each presentation. You'll have it timed.
I can give you 5 minutes left then, Mark.
So you have a signal. When it's become red,
then yeah, then I'll be quiet. Yes.
Just
okay. So good morning, and I'm glad everyone was able to make it here today, including me.
Slowly.
Yes.
Because you are fluent in English, which is maybe not the case to everybody.
Yes. Okay. Thanks for reminding me. People in America tell me I talk too fast, so I probably talk too fast all the time, but I will try and talk slower. So basically, this is a study, an analysis of three separate energy efficiency programs that targeted low and moderate income customers in the United States, and it's really kind of a comparison of the different methodological choices and ways in which we did process evaluations to better understand these programs. So they said when preparing your slides, you're supposed to start with a question. So what do low and moderate income customers need most from their utility partners? In the United States, the programs are delivered by utilities primarily, sometimes energy organizations funded by utilities, but mostly by utilities. The answer is innovative and out-of-the-box program designs. We've been working on energy efficiency and low-income weatherization programs now for 30 or 40 years, but we still have new ways of we're still struggling with how best to reach these customers. They're considered vulnerable. There's a lot of barriers. And so one of the things that this paper highlights is some of the interesting approaches to reach this really vulnerable target. So here they are. The first one is the Maryland Energy Efficiency Tune-Up Program, or MEET, and that is offered through the Department of Housing and Department of Community Housing, anyway, in Maryland, the DHCD, and it's offered as a program to reach previous program participants and encourage them to continue thinking about energy efficiency and provide strategies for them to continue to reduce energy on their own after the weatherization services have been provided. The second one is energy efficiency for nonprofits, offered by a utility in Missouri, which actually targets not the customers per se, but the people who use homeless shelters, rely on food banks, those types of community organizations that are reaching into the cities, through different sorts of services, education, addiction counseling, housing. But it's not a typical target for low-income programs. So they were thinking, well, these nonprofits are serving the low-income communities. Why don't we offer them discounts or free services, because these are going to eventually benefit our community as well. And they're very vulnerable customers who live in these communities, but they're, housing organizations. For example, women in crisis, those types of things. And if they can actually afford to make retrofit improvements like energy efficiency furnaces, upgrades, things like that, then the utility will actually double the rebate amount. So it's a combination of education, direct installation of some measures, and then encourage them to do more energy savings. And the last one, this is one I didn't do the evaluation on, but I was fascinated. In Energy Trust of Oregon actually has a program that targets manufactured homes, which are sometimes mobile homes that people live in, and it's usually folks who live in mobile homes are low to moderate income. They're very, very prevalent in certain parts of the United States, including Oregon, and they're usually people that are very vulnerable, and the housing is substandard often. So this one is actually sort of the ultimate rebate, where you get a new manufactured home. And as you can imagine, that has a lot of complicating factors involved. So this is the different types of process evaluation methodologies that were used to conduct these evaluations. And they're pretty much a combination, like all good process evaluations, of surveys and in-depth interviews and reviews of the program materials. The energy efficiency nonprofit program, which I did the evaluation on, was very small. It was a very small pilot program, so we really didn't have a lot to do except talk to the folks who were directly influenced in the housing organizations. So I talked to the managers of the YMCA and the women's shelters, and sort of what kinds of activities did they benefit from and what did they learn. So the MEET program actually has quite a few examples because frankly, it was a program that had a great idea. It was actually innovative. It was combining behavioral change with direct installation of audit measures like lighting, new lights and filters, and cleaning and tuning the air conditioner, the HVAC. But it was following up on customers who had participated in the program 5 years or so before. So there's a lot of challenges. Customers didn't understand what this program was. They were familiar with the program they'd received, but they had no idea what this one was. And they were combining education with weatherization. And so there was a lot of new challenges. One of the biggest challenges was it happened to be launched in the middle of, or right before COVID. So enrollment was certainly affected as well. And now the good news is it's gone to a full statewide program. I just completed that evaluation, and it is much more successful. They got all the kinks worked out, but the process evaluation helped identify some of the challenges. One of the big ones is they made everybody who participated in the program, before the auditor came to visit them or did a virtual visit, he would actually ask them, or she, to make a pledge to reduce their energy savings activity, to make different pledges to reduce energy usage by changing their behavior. And would they agree to lower the thermostat, or turn off the lights, or turn off the water, or whatever, or water temperature, or use the microwave, things like that. And this is what they said they did. Now we have a very small survey sample. It's, full disclosure, this is a qualitative analysis, but most people said that they would do stuff and then they either didn't do it or didn't remember that they had said they had done it, because like most behavioral programs, getting customers to actually do things that they promise they're going to do is always the challenge. But it was kind of an interesting first look at what things they were thinking about. Some of the biggest challenges with this particular program was that customers didn't understand what was going on. This was a new program. It was the same weatherization contractor that had probably come by and done measures in their house a few years ago, maybe put in new insulation or fix the cracks in the walls or something, but this, or put in new, something to their home, but this was not that. This was different. So they were really confused about, well, why am I doing this? The second one is that, as we know, low income and moderate income customers are very difficult to reach, and you don't really want to do a mass marketing campaign, because if you do a mass marketing campaign, then you're going to offer services to customers that aren't going to qualify. So you really have to rely on a very targeted approach. However, the direct mail didn't generate much interest because customers threw it away. They didn't understand what it was. And then the perceived stranger danger, and this is very common in among senior citizens who are involved in these programs. They're like, is it too good to be true? Who are you? It's COVID. I didn't want people in my house. And then they eventually switched to virtual audits, which helped, but there was still this perception of stranger danger. So the evaluation, though, the process evaluation came to the rescue and basically identified some ways to improve the program while it was still being in pilot. One was to combine target mailings with actually direct door-to-door follow-up telephone calls, and even knocking on the doors, explaining in certain neighborhoods what this program was and why we were offering it. And then one of the problems was the contractors, who are also weatherization contractors and do all the other kinds of work weatherization contractors do, didn't ever really do clean-in tunes for HVAC systems. It's when you basically check the refrigerant charge and you make sure it's working. They were very reluctant to go into a building or a home that had an old air conditioner and touch it, for fear that it would break. And then the customer would be like, we broke it. Probably was already broken, but that doesn't matter. So there was a liability issue, and there was a concern that they weren't getting paid enough and the liability was too high for the amount they were being received. So they did improve the price and also created a liability waiver for these contractors to have the customer say, if we understand that you're going to touch our air conditioner, and you're not responsible if you break it. They actually had to extend that waiver to also include refrigerators when they were cleaning the coils on the refrigerators too. And then the other part was really critical, was to educate both the staff and the contractors about why it's important to do clean and tunes for HVAC equipment. Again, that's not the normal thing that HVAC weatherization contractors do. And they had never really, that's not what they're focused on. They're focused on putting in new equipment or repairing the equipment. So this was a new challenge for them as well. They do it in the commercial, they do it in the residential market programs, but they don't do it for low income programs. So it was an educational change. The energy efficiency for nonprofits really focused on, this is what happens when I talk too slow. The energy efficiency in nonprofits targeted about 5 to 9 buildings and ended up serving 16 buildings in the social service world, which was really very, very good. And they actually exceeded their expectations. Again, these were organizations that served the homeless, unemployed veterans, children and women. I mean, people who are really at the edges of society. And they operated facilities. Some of them even had housing units. And basically, they did an energy audit, and then they just installed direct measures. They received new lighting and new filters and new air conditioning. And actually, one organization was able to get a new HVAC unit. And the best thing, one of the clear takeaways was that the energy audits identified areas for future savings, that when they have the funding, they'll proceed it. I'm not going to explain this. This is like one of the logic models to, talk about a customer journey. The short answer is it's very complicated to replace someone's manufactured home. And it goes through a lot of barriers and a lot of challenges. And it was more than either Energy Trust envisioned or the implementers envisioned, or even the evaluators when they're trying to do it. And Opinion Dynamics actually did this evaluation. But what they found was that, not surprising, process evaluations confirmed that manufacturing houses, which were mostly built before 1994, were very old and leaky and needed energy efficiency, and they were basically not worth repairing. They really needed to be replaced. However, these are participants that are living on the edge of society. They're worried about paying their rent, and they're also worried about moving out of their homes. I mean, this is a big ask. So some of the challenges were that the participants were excited but cautious, sort of like, well, what are we going to do? And the funding, they had funding leverage from all these different sources to basically help them move into a new manufactured homes at little to no cost. However, there were still some barriers. The costs were very widespread, and they couldn't really pinpoint how much is the contribution that the utility, or in this case, Energy Trust, needed to make. And it was very difficult for them. And these are people with low incomes and, sometimes spotty income. So it was hard to estimate. And then this is one of the bigger challenges. That they found out that the new homes didn't always fit on the lots that they had previously been on. And so then they had to go find new lots. In addition to they have to move into a house, they also have to find a better location, which was another barrier, another cost. But the good news is we do have non-energy benefits that were calculated, including improved thermal health and comfort. And so the conclusions are that, modifying the program approach is something that we really need to think about. And that one of the reasons that the process evaluation was critical, and I wanted to share about it, is they were able to make these mid-course corrections. And that's one of the best reasons to do a process evaluation of a pilot. It also helped to clarify the roles and really get it up to speed before it went to a widespread statewide implementation. And again, you can't really have one size fits all. You really do need to have customized approaches with customized energy consumption reports based on different, ways in which the customers feel comfortable modifying their behavior. And then also, I thought the Evergy program identified ways to reach non-traditional low-income targets. I mean, nobody thinks about the homeless shelters that are, ubiquitous and are in the communities, and that is an area that really should be addressed in future programs. And so basically, it provides efficient updates and customized program offerings. And it does use a lot. We do get a lot of not only energy benefits, but also non-energy benefits. One of the most interesting things that the nonprofit pilot taught me program was that customers said when they put in the new lighting, the mood changed. All of a sudden, people were happier. The dining hall looked better. The food seemed to taste better. Visibility, security, all of a sudden they weren't afraid anymore. I don't think there's a monetization yet on reducing your fear, but that is something that is a non-energy benefit, especially for these customers and organizations who are serving, people that are in risk. So basically, the key takeaway is that we have to, there's good tried and true measures and program designs, but we also have to think more creatively when we're targeting low-income communities and think beyond just the residents and looking to the organizations that serve them. That was me on slow speed.
I forgot to introduce yourself. Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. Okay. So I'm, hello. So I'm Dr. Catherine Johnson. I've been an energy evaluator for a long time, 30 years. I just had a birthday yesterday, so I really feel old. But I've been in the business for 30 years. I've been doing program process evaluations and impact evaluations in the United States and Canada. And in my spare time, I actually have a TV show called goldbravetv.com, and it's basically on energy news, breaking news for residents. And one of my messages is you have to eat your energy efficiency vegetables before you get renewable dessert. So the point is I'm always emphasizing new ways that customers should think about saving energy in their home before they spend money on things that may not actually work for them. So, but it's fun. I've been doing it a long time, and I'm happy to be here.
So a lot of experience. Personally, I like the third program. I think it's a new approach, but it's maybe specific to US.
Yes, it is.
We don't have so much mobile home.
Right.
And of course, Jean-Sébastien say no, as usual, when I say something. Okay, so I open the floor for a question. Sorry.
Okay, I've got quite a loud voice, but I'm speaking to. Yeah, sorry. My name's Owen Davis. I'm at BAYES, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in the UK. I also work on energy efficiency and retrofit stuff. Just wondering, I mean, it's probably quite obvious, I guess, but if you could say a bit more about the benefits of engaging people who had previously been involved in schemes and whether you looked at that sort of through the evaluation and how that led to behavior change, how that led to also the point around trust and suspicion. That's come up in some of our schemes as well, people thinking it's too good to be true and this kind of thing. And just whether, reaching out to the same groups is bringing about some of the longer term changes that we want. Well,
those are excellent questions, and I'll try and remember them. The first one is tapping into previous program participants. The Maryland Department of Community and Housing Development, I knew I'd get it eventually, is really concerned, and in Maryland especially, where I live, they're concerned about making sure it has to do with equity and social equity, and energy poverty is a big deal, especially in Baltimore where the pilot was. There's a lot of very poor people, and there are a lot of people who are vulnerable, and they were looking for ways to extend the program on a not too expensively, but also broaden the reach, and also try and figure out a way to re-engage customers, because they can get their weatherization services every 5 years or so, but they wanted to sort of help them realize there were things that they could do and give them some sense of empowerment that, yeah, we came in and we fixed your furnace, but you guys can save energy too by lowering your thermostat, or by, not using equipment, turning off equipment, things that are really simple and easy to do. And it was kind of giving them some sense of empowerment and giving them a sense of you're responsible too. It's not just the electric bill, the gas bill is something you have no control over. That's not true. And really educating them, which has resonated fairly well, because a lot of the folks that are served are are senior citizens or on fixed incomes. And, they are hesitant to seek help in the first place. But if you can tell them ways that they can do it themselves, it makes them feel like, okay, I'm not helpless. And so the second question had to do with suspicion and participant. I called it stranger danger. And that's very common. Again, a lot of these folks are older and have maybe been a victim of scams, or they know people who have. So one of the ways that they got around that was by actually going into the neighborhoods, and because these are targeted neighborhoods, these folks tend to live in the same areas, and do a door knock. They actually went and had their badges and explained the program. It was a little more resource intensive than they thought, but he really helped them get over that barrier. And once you make a inroad into the community, believe me, word spreads. And then people realize, oh, this is something else I can do. It's not just this one program every 5 years. This is something else I can do. The good news is now that the program is up and running, they can get services within 1 and 2 years after they're participated. So the gap's not as long, and people then remember what the deal is. And the other interesting thing is they're signing the same weatherization contractor to do this program that did the original weatherization services, not the same people, because these are a lower need. These aren't, you don't need a qualified weatherization implementer to go and do an audit, but it's a good training ground for them. And it's a way for them to continue the conversation. And then customers goes, oh, I remember you. You came over to my house 2 years ago and did these things. Okay, and what are you going to do now? So it's really helped reduce that barrier.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi, Catherine. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. In Europe, also we see many now pilot programs or small-scale programs tackling energy poverty in various ways, various approaches. And then the main question, I think now, as Didier reminded, the problem is not a few hundred of people, that's millions of people. So in the evaluation, did you look at replicability or scale-up? Because as far as I understood, that's 3 pilots. So was it part of the job of your job to tell something about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so the first one, the MEET program, was a pilot, and now it's scaled up statewide in Maryland. They had a delay with COVID, and apparently contracts in Maryland take a long time to get done. I'm sure something you're never familiar with in Europe, right? Bureaucracy. So it took about 9 months to get the new contracts issued. But now the program, I just completed the first evaluation for the statewide rollout. A lot of the challenges that we identified in the pilot, they'd already fixed and were proactively moving forward. What they also did was extend the list of eligible contractors who could do the work. It wasn't just the nonprofit agencies that work with them, but also for-profit contractors and some of them were so eager to get started that they actually went through their quota in the first 4 months. Now, they don't have a big quota, it's a little utility, but still they were up and running. And so now the program has become a really, the commission is very proud of it. The program manager, I think it's her favorite program. So it gets a lot of press in Maryland about how effective it is. So it's been a success. The nonprofit was a pilot just for a year. They were just sort of testing it out. Evergy does this they test out new ideas all the time. Some of the pilots work, some of them don't. This one worked, but they don't know what the next step is because it was supposed to only be a year. They did get a lot of goodwill in the community, and they were in the middle of just did a merger, so goodwill's a good thing, but they're not really sure what the next step is. And the manufactured pilots program, that actually did become more of a statewide approach. Energy Trust of Oregon approach, but there's so many challenges. It hasn't been replicated in other jurisdictions just because financing a new home, new manufactured home, that's a huge job. So I think it's a great idea, but I think it's really more challenging than people really even understood.
It's bizarre because my own understanding is that the last program is, for me, the most replicable one. You just have the issue of just. This is the financial issue. It's a classic.
Right.
So I think for me, the last one could be the most replicable.
Okay. Well,
it seems it's not your advice.
I would love to see it.
But it will be my favorite question after each presentation. What is the level of replicability? If there are other questions, yes, please.
Have you looked at it more, in greater detail to look at the physical health and mental health impacts of this kind of programs, or do you know about studies?
There are studies. These 3 didn't really focus on that, but Maryland has done. There's a Home and Healthy initiative in Maryland. It's probably a national initiative, but it's based in Maryland, and it's a Healthy Homes initiative, and that basically is working with the people who have asthma and helping to fund energy efficiency improvements in low and moderate income homes for folks who have respiratory issues. So that's actually something that's been going on. And frankly, there's a lot more emphasis on low and moderate income programs tying into health and safety, health, comfort, and safety, but primarily health. The Con Medicine in Chicago, where I work, also has done a lot of work trying to quantify the health benefits for residential customers from low-income programs. And in that program, they actually got the doctors to prescribe weatherization as a way to reduce or eliminate asthma in certain homes. So they, your prescription, get your mold taken out of your home, and then the program would pay for the mold remediation. But it would be a prescription from a doctor. It's a very innovative idea. There's a lot of challenges. We're still looking through it, but there's been some interesting things, and I can help you later. All righty. Well, thank you so much.
I have one.
Okay.
Could you go back to the slide where you show the action that has been taken? It's at the beginning of your presentation, where you have a graph with a list of actions. You remember at the beginning of the
methodology?
No, the first one of the. Come back.
Yeah.
Not this
Sorry,
one.
I put in all these transitions.
It's in the beginning. Yes, that one. It's to illustrate the issue in the debate between sufficiency and efficiency.
This one?
No. The next one, where you have different action.
Oh, the
next one.
The behaviors.
Yes, that one.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. So for me, if you are in fuel poverty, you are at the maximum of your, let's say, behavioral limit.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, you eat at 15 or 15 degrees. So all the action you are here is behavioral things. So for me, they are not fuel poor because they have some potential to do that.
Right.
It's a little bit provocative, but for me, the lowering thermostat set point, if they are really fuel poor, they should have done that. So just to illustrate that this issue between sufficiency and fuel poverty is it's questionable, and it's I think it's room for practitioners and academics. So I don't want to
makes
just
sense. Yeah.
For me, I don't understand that type of action for fuel poor.
I understand.
Except to say that fuel poor, I understand they have some technical potential. They can change their air conditioning, they can insulate. But in principle, if they are really fuel poor, they are at the maximum of behavioral change.
Right.
Okay, this is.
Thank you very much.
Of course, I see all the sociologists and saying like that, but it's just a provocative issue, how to make the difference between sufficiency and efficiency. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Next presentation, it's from Ute Dubois, and please could you introduce yourself? It's better that if I will do myself.
Yes, of course. So good morning, everybody. So I'm Ute Dubois. I'm a teacher of economics at a French business school called ISG, and I'm doing my research on energy poverty, well, for over 10 years now. And I will present you a paper which is work in progress on methodological challenges in qualitative research. And this is a work I have done with a colleague from Romania who could not be here today, unfortunately, Anca Sinea. So we have worked on a set of research publications, well, articles, reports, etc., to identify what are the characteristics in terms of methodology when you analyze energy poverty. Well, there has been over the past years a considerable development in research on energy poverty topics, well, with a lot of things on definitions, measurements, etc. The variety of energy poverty over different regions. For example, in Europe now we have there is a body of knowledge showing that, well, how energy poverty manifests itself is very different from one place to another. And of course, the variety of policy options, even if, well, what the discussion we had this morning is that, well, often people are subsidized to pay for energy, which is maybe not the best solution. So, but what we wanted to do is to look at surveys which look at qualitative, who look at the qualitative aspect. So surveys made by sociologists, for example, which look at characteristics of energy poor households. So, and here the idea is really to understand how energy poverty works. So the lived experience of people, the coping behaviors, people's capability, trajectories, and the kind of trade-offs people make in their day-to-day lives. And here, our question is, well, what do researchers say on, well, what is specific about energy poverty? Is it only household vulnerability? So we have to do with energy, with households who are on low incomes, well, which is already difficult. And so researching this kind of problematics is already a challenge. But here our idea is that we say that energy poverty can be specific because it's poverty which occurs inside the home. And so this raises a number of issues because, well, home is it's not housing, it's not the dwelling, it's really what in English we call home. In French, we don't have the term for that. So looking at home is really an invasion of the private space of people, which can be problematic when you want to do research on the experiences of people. And also we have the topic of energy, which adds some more complexity to the question, because here we have, in the case of energy, well, it's a consumption, but it's not only a consumption, it's an essential service. It provides you with comfort. It allows you to take a shower and to be clean, etc. So cleanliness, comfort, and convenience. And it obliges, if you talk about energy, you are obliged to interact with providers of energy sources, with certain institutions to help you. And of course, you have also some decisions that you can take. So you do not self-restrict totally on everything. You can, well, the heat or eat debate is part of these trade-offs. And so, well, what we wanted to know is whether energy poverty is somehow specific, and what we learn about how to research energy poverty in qualitative studies. So this is still work in progress. So we will be happy to learn from, well, get feedback from you on this. So what we did until now is that we looked at 30 different research outputs, academic articles, but articles are not generally presenting their methodology in a very detailed way. This is why we looked also at thesis reports, which are based on interviews with households. We coded, we coded these interviews and these articles to look at what are the methodological aspects presented by researchers and that are discussed. And what we look is, well, really the practical implementation. And, well, one limit here of our study is that, of course, these studies often focus on the research question, the findings, but not so often on how they proceed to find or to say how they did their research. And so this is the kind of the question we want to address. Okay, so in terms of findings, I will present 4 findings from our research. The first one is on the concept of energy poverty. Well, we all know the huge literature on definitions of energy poverty. But in practice, when researchers investigate energy poverty by talking to households, they don't ask people, are you energy poor? They don't use definition because they don't have the possibility to measure the households of the incomes of households, etc. And so here the problem is, how do you find households that are actually energy poor? And here we see that there are a lot of pragmatic approaches, like going to see households who are on low income or who are experiencing certain forms of precariousness, looking at certain types of households, for example, the elderly or young people, for example, students, looking at recipients of certain benefits, or asking third parties, for example, social workers, charities, to say, well, tell us who is energy poor and who we can talk to. And what is kind of surprising here is that actually researchers don't view it as a problem. Well, we have a lot of precise definitions of energy poverty, but still, when we want to talk to energy poor people, we don't need the definitions. And anyway, there are so many of them. Second aspect is about identifying and recruiting interviewees. Well, finding people is not that easy because, well, or people who are vulnerable in general, they don't want to show, even more when it touches the private space, which is the home. And energy poverty is difficult because people don't say, well, I'm vulnerable on my energy consumption. Well, sometimes they say, I cannot pay my bills, I'm feeling cold inside my home. But, and for many people, this situation of energy poverty and deprivation is something normal. It's part of their life, of their routines. And so they don't qualify themselves as energy poor. And so how can we reach these people who are hidden? And what are the kind of research, the recruitment strategies we can use for that? So again, here, what happens is that people use, or researchers use, intermediaries. So they go to see those people who are already known, for example, by social workers, etc. Well, we have seen a few studies where there is an approach to contact people who come to public spaces, for example, to municipal social services to ask for help. And also one strategy is to not explain really the topic of research in detail, because, well, somehow there is a fear that people might run away. And here you see that this is a difficulty in many studies where researchers who have not been able to recruit as many candidates as they wanted. And so one question we have is, well, do the hidden energy poor become visible through this process, or do they finally remain hidden in qualitative research? Well, we guess they might remain hidden to some extent. A third topic is reluctance to participate. And this reluctance to participate from the part of households can be linked to vulnerability and the fact that, in general, people have low levels of trust in institutions, trust in suppliers, etc. The social workers who are supposed to help them are not necessarily seen as friendly all the time. Well, when it comes to letting somebody enter your home, it's even more difficult. And when you talk about energy, it can be very difficult also because, well, explaining one's difficulties and realizing that's a problem, it's an effort. And if researchers come and say, well, we can have an energy diary to follow what you are doing, this can even be more complex. And so here the challenge is really to show trustworthiness. How is it done? Well, first, here again, we have the use of partners who are really central at many stages of this research process, who somehow certify that the researcher is trustworthy and that research is legitimate, that the researcher can ask these questions. Then there are other approaches like guaranteeing anonymity, allowing interviewees to withdraw from the research at any time. Other approaches have consisted in interviewing people in a neutral space, but then there is a loss of information because you don't visit the people's home, and so you are somehow obliged to believe what they say. And so again here, the question is, well, if people are very fragile and don't have this a minimum level of trust in somebody, well, will they accept being interviewed? And so, well, the question is, to what extent does the information we gather from this, to what extent are we able to gather reliable information or complete information? And finally, a last topic which has been discussed in certain research works is the engagement in the human relation with households. Because finally, when you interview people about their situation of energy poverty, it's not about asking people about, well, any kind of consumption decision. It's much more because, well, people are in a situation of vulnerability, they have feelings of inferiority, and so they might not understand what researchers want. So people have also the fear of being judged. And and so here the challenge is really to manage this ambivalence that you have as a researcher, because you want the people to trust you, but you need to commit as well, to have people to bring people to tell you something. And so here it's the human aspect and the question of how far can you go in this human relation. So here, in terms of strategies, well, of course, it's important to explain, for example, that you are doing a research, so you are not a social worker, and as a researcher, you are not here to help people to solve their problems. But this can generate some frustrations. Well, of course, then empathy, active listening, and this is important also to detect, for example, people's emotions, which they do not show easily. Sometimes people have strategies such as the use of humor to minimize their difficulties. So this is these are things which really need an interaction with people. And then there is the relational aspect, which is a kind of relation similar to an exchange of gifts, in the sense that somehow, as a researcher, you cannot reduce the difficulties of people in energy poverty. It's not your job. But what you can do is to give them something, and as people dedicate some time to your research, give you information, you have to give something in exchange. And so this is, for example, the case of researchers who will provide information, help interviewees in their administrative formalities, etc. Or they can simply give empathy and listen to the difficulties of people. So this is not highlighted in many analyses, and our impression was that some analyses remain a bit on the surface, and others go much more into deeper in this kind of questioning. So what can we conclude from that? Well, we have an impression that there are some specificities when we look at energy poverty. So it's not just looking at the difficulties of people who are simply poor. And the main aspect is that energy poverty touches on many aspects which are very private, hidden, related to the domestic space, related to practice of which people are not even conscious. And so this is our challenges. Sorry, I will have destroyed your machine by the end of this presentation. I'm really sorry. I think I will put it. So this is really a challenge for researchers, because it means that they have to unveil certain things and be aware of the fact that, well, the first discourse of people is not necessarily the right one, and so what we have seen is that in qualitative study there are really different intensities of what researchers are doing in terms of knowing better the characteristics and the decisions of energy vulnerable households. Well, just in terms of limitations, well, these methodological challenges that we analyze through literature analysis are not always described precisely. Sometimes researchers seem aware of it and they mention these difficulties, but it's not always the case. And of course, there is a variation in research strategies. So there is not one strategy, not one fits all solution. The context and the type of question you want to investigate also influence the ability of researchers, or the willingness to really go into the detail of investigating this, of addressing these different challenges. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Are you sociologist, statistician, economist?
I'm an economist.
Economist, okay. Thank you for this presentation. So it's a research for researchers.
Yes.
I can say that in that way. You mentioned the issue of bonus, what they get. I think when we make surveys, for instance, for consumption and so on, we give a lottery ticket.
Yes.
So you have some interest to answer to your question. So you mentioned that, but very quickly at the end. So what they get from the interviews to exchange and to give some private life issues. Okay. So question from the audience. So the new ones first.
Lisa Groves from Ricardo EEE. Really interesting presentation. I think strikes a lot of similarities with what we've been seeing in some of the funding for decarbonising low-income households in the UK. I thought it was really interesting that you picked up that the studies that you looked at didn't have a sort of common, clear explanation of the methodology that they took. I wonder if you were able to sort of say what are some of the most, from that, what you were able to find, were there some common threads of strategies that were more successful, or was it really too difficult to actually pick out those common threads? I like the lottery ticket idea. That's quite a good one.
Well, in terms of common aspects, well, I was surprised to see that so many people rely on external partners to recruit energy poor households. So the options available to find people who will be willing to answer the questions seems really something difficult. So this surprised me personally. And then, yes, well, the variety of options people have to propose rewards. So often researchers mention a financial reward as you were giving a certain amount, or something which allows you to purchase something in a supermarket or whatever. But this relational aspect is not mentioned so often. So that's something I found surprising.
So research interest consultants is good. What are the other? Okay, seems the same. No, it's.
Thank you very much. So I'm just about to start some research, which is in-home participant observation of energy poor households, and it's the first time we're doing it as part of an evaluation I'm working on. One thing I'm a bit concerned about is whether the researchers, so as part of that, the researchers are going to sort of make notes of non-verbal communication and so it's quite detailed notes of the interaction with the participant. And from sort of some of the academic literature on ethnographic type research like this, sometimes you have this issue where the researcher's interpretation is not aligned with what the participant sort of thinks, and then so they're writing down all this information about, participant said this or looked like they meant this, and then there's examples where they then present it back to the participant, and the participant said, no, this is nonsense, I didn't mean this at all, this kind of thing. I'm just wondering if anything like that, so I think this is about reflexivity in the research, if anything like that came up in your literature review, or if you had any general thoughts on that sort of the position of the researcher, in a sort of relational context like that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. No, I don't think so. I haven't found much on that, and maybe this is also linked to the specificity of the topic, because you will interview people about their use of energy, their day-to-day practices, but you don't necessarily go and tell people, explain people what energy poverty is and what you want to learn about energy poverty. And so finally, if they read or learn what you have written or how you interpret it, it might be difficult because this is not what they view. So, but yeah.
I mean, we're going to publish what we say.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you. Before passing the question, about your limitation, will you explore the same type of approach, but by type of fuel pool? A student or a woman which is retired in a rural area, it's not the same thing to interview. So I think you may have to explain all these things, but taking into account the difference between the type of fuel pool. I think it's very different to interview a student or a poor workers, etc.
Yeah, that's totally well. I totally agree with it, and in the groups that have been interviewed, yes, the elderly people are an important group, but then still researchers say, well, there are a lot of stereotypes attached to being old, and so can we analyze old people as a homogeneous group? That's not totally sure. Well, for the students, there are some common aspects, which is the fact that, well, they tend to view their situation as transitory. And so here there is maybe some more common aspects because, well, they are somehow confident in the future. And so here there is really a work to identify what are the specificities of energy poverty, and because they are really hidden.
Thank you. Kate Jenkins from the Energy Saving Trust in the UK. Thanks for a really interesting presentation, and we do a fair amount of work trying to interact with fuel poor, energy poor households. Just following on from your response to Lisa's question, really, about the fact that organisations kind of working with partner organisations to get to these people, and certainly that's one of the routes that we use. And I just wondered whether you had any views on kind of whether you said that you were surprised by that, and whether you had any views on kind of if there were kind of disadvantages to doing that, or indeed advantages to kind of using that approach.
Well, the disadvantage can be that you will reach people who are already known. And so many people who are hidden, those who pay their bills, who don't necessarily ask for help, these ones can be hidden. And so maybe the extreme energy poor, the extremely energy poor are not included in this kind of studies. And also, this is one thing we found also, it's the fact that these organizations who act as intermediaries, they sometimes decide to exclude certain households from the survey because they are too energy poor. So, and so maybe it's good to investigate the less severe forms of energy poverty, but if you want really to look into the very severe forms of energy poverty, maybe, well, it can be difficult.
You and last question or last.
Tammy Rasmussen from Evergreen Economics, and I work on poverty research in the U.S. And I have a related question. If you came across barriers to like bias of the sample, so you were talking about that, or basically knowing that they have a representative group. So if a lot of the studies are relying on the partners, did any of the studies talk about the challenges, and did they take any steps to try to balance out the group and make it less biased or more representative?
No, actually, this is not often mentioned, this aspect, the fact of eliminating bias. They're already happy that they could found a number of interviewees, they use also the snowballing, so they ask people, well, do you know somebody who I could ask? And so the samples of people who are interviewed in qualitative surveys, it's generally not so representative. So and that's also one striking thing.
Thank you.
Maybe one last short question with short answer. You don't want to answer the question? Okay, thank you. Thank you. So we have a researcher we want to go on field. This is good. Thank you for your presentation. It's really interesting. So now we are going to Australia and to see how we can challenge to benchmark EU and the Australian situation. So please, the floor is yours. And could you introduce yourself?
Yes. Yes, of course. Hi, everyone. I'm Victoria. I'm a research assistant at Öko Institute in Berlin. I selfishly only put my name on the presentation, but we had a large project team at Öko working on this project, as well as project partners in Australia at the University of Melbourne. So the idea of this project was to share lessons from the EU and from Australia's low carbon transitions with a specific focus on energy affordability. This had kind of two components. One focused on an analysis of energy prices, and then we focused in the second section on the impacts that these have on vulnerable groups. And the comparison between EU and Australia might seem a little bit strange, but this comparative perspective actually was a really good chance for mutual learning. And we had kind of these two big questions. Does a cleaner, greener electricity system necessarily mean rising costs for consumers? Or can this actually lead to improvements for affordability? And this big question was really what came from our Australian partners, where this was kind of the public debate was around these questions of energy affordability in relation to a change in the electricity system. Now, we completed this project in February of this year. There have been significant changes since then, obviously related to electricity prices, but also to policies related to vulnerable groups and affordability. So I will try to get into that a little bit. We're working on kind of updating the findings from both of the reports that we published, but this is still kind of a work in progress, actually. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about this price and cost structure comparison that we did. This is not my expertise. I'll be honest, so I'm just going to give a very brief overview of what's happened there and refer you to the fact that updated results of our report are probably going to be submitted for publishing this week. So what we did is we basically looked at what's happening in Australia with the energy prices and at 5 countries in the EU. And actually, this kind of comparison did work quite well because the individual states in Australia have quite a lot of autonomy when it comes to the electricity sector, and they have very varied electricity mixes and markets. So this kind of comparison worked quite well. We saw overall that there was an increase in renewables in the EU. This is more policy driven, while it's more market driven in Australia. And the really important message for the Australian colleagues was that this influx of renewables didn't necessarily mean increases in wholesale electricity prices. So this decoupling of CO2 intensity and household electricity prices was a really important message for our colleagues in Australia. Now, in the medium term, these kinds of changes are more complex, but we did see, for example, within the course of the project that there was a big closure of a coal plant in one of the states in Australia. This was very uncoordinated. It resulted in high price volatilities within the state, but also more broadly in Australia. And obviously a lot of media and political attention there, not very happy about these kind of processes. But within the EU market, we have a much higher interconnectivity, and this actually helps to absorb these kinds of shocks. Now, we also looked at the fact that an influx of renewables might lead to higher fixed costs, but this is actually very varied among member states and in Australia and the different states as well. And of course, the taxes and levies are a really important element in the EU, in the electricity prices, actually within all 5 of the countries that we looked at, but it's not very common in Australia. Although I think in the EU, we are also seeing a shift in the kind of financing mechanisms for renewables to federal budgets, for example. So this is just a really quick overview. And I think the thing that I really want to focus on for this session is this kind of the impacts that electricity prices have on households. So in this comparison, we can see the share of household expenditure or household income that's spent on energy for Australia and the EU 27. And we see that although overall in the EU, households pay a much larger share of their income on energy than in Australia. This gap between the lowest income groups and the highest income groups is actually a lot higher in Australia than it is in the EU. So that big spike there is the problem that they're dealing with in Australia. So we then took a look at what's happening at EU level, so kind of the supranational, super-regional approach that we've taken in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, and to try to see if we can see any similar things happening in Australia or not. So, of course, in the EU, we have a really strong foundation for recognizing and tackling energy poverty, at least within kind of on a policy level. They were very interested in just transition principle that we have at EU level. And then we also see this work that we've done toward working towards definitions within the energy poverty recommendation, but also more recently in the Social Climate Fund. We've developed indicators. There is data available across the EU to identify energy poverty. And we have these designated institutions, the EPOV, but also the Energy Poverty Advisory Hub, which is focusing a lot more on policy now. So this is the kind of things that are happening or have happened on the EU level, and that they were very interested to know a little bit more about. And we also see this very heavy focus on energy efficiency when it comes to measures and instruments, at least within a few of the big member states in the EU. So we do see this coupling, I think, of energy poverty and energy efficiency, at least within the documentation. What that looks like on the ground is obviously a different question. But this was really interesting for our colleagues in Australia, because there isn't really any mention of energy poverty. They use the term energy hardship a lot more. It's not discussed on a national level. It's not discussed politically. But there are kind of a range of consumer protection or complementary measures that are related to consumer protection mechanisms. So this focuses predominantly on disconnections or preventing disconnections, because they see quite a high number of self-disconnections within households to manage their kind of household budgets. And they do have sort of national frameworks that oblige energy firms to ensure connections, to avoid disconnections. And they work with a lot of kind of third-party actors, so financial consultants. And we see that across member states in the EU as well, of course, kind of within more hardship management processes. So you have this really strong focus on kind of a social policy or protection policy side there. And we also see a discourse that's very closely linked to kind of consumer agency and market participation. So it's really important for low-income households or vulnerable groups to be able to participate in the market. This is kind of the big discussion point there. And what's really lacking at an Australian level is this really limited focus on energy efficiency. So there's a very limited number of projects to improve energy efficiency in Australia, and very limited focus on low-income households or other vulnerable groups. They're basically non-existent, actually, at Australian level. And of course, they were very interested in the overarching framework that we have through the EU, because this doesn't really happen in Australia. They also don't have this framework where the energy transition includes any kind of equity principles. So they were very interested in kind of the messaging around energy transition and equity. So there's no clear definition, there's no measurement, there's no reporting, there's no monitoring of energy hardship or energy poverty, whatever you want to call it, basically. Now, the performance and implementation in the EU and at member state level is obviously very varied. We have the NECPs, where households or member states have to report on energy poverty, but this is defined as what they should include this in their NECPs if there are a significant number of households in energy poverty. This is not clearly defined anywhere else, and it's meant that some member states are actually not reporting on energy poverty or energy poverty measures at all, although this might not link 100% to what's happening within the member states. For those countries that do focus on these kinds of energy poverty issues. Energy efficiency is kind of the big policy that we see. There's a number of housing renovation policies that dominate, but of course we also have direct financial support, social tariffs, but we do actually see very little focus beyond the building sector. So there's kind of a decoupling of what's happening in the social policy sphere to tackle energy affordability, and what's happening maybe in the energy policy sphere related to energy poverty that's very closely linked to the building sector and energy efficiency. So this kind of interaction between energy and climate policy and social policy is very varied. I come from a German perspective there. I can definitely say that energy poverty is discussed very little, and focus primarily lies within social policy and not energy policy, and this is something we're trying to change. So we have the strong EU framework, but a very differentiated way of dealing with energy poverty across the member states. And what we see in Australia then in this kind of relation is this kind of top-down and bottom-up approach. So there's kind of both happening. So again, going back to this idea of market participation, there's been a rapid rollout of EVs and of solar. So there's kind of more providers, there's more complex cost allocations happening, and there's a much more or a much better understanding that there's multiple actors that bear the responsibilities for enabling market participation for all kinds of households, including vulnerable households. And there's a much more mature discussion happening there about protections and cost relief within these new energy services that we don't, or I don't think we see as much in the EU, but correct me if I'm wrong. We also see that they're providing a lot more information, and there's a really focus on developing energy literacy to improve decision making also of vulnerable households to kind of take advantage of new products and new services. We also see really high smart meter deployment in Australia. Whether we think this is helpful or not, or benefits low-income households, I think is kind of still up for discussion. I think, except with the exception of the UK and maybe even Italy, smart meter deployment in the EU or in Europe has been relatively slow in comparison. And what we also see, and what we thought was really interesting from the EU perspective, is that there's a much larger focus on this kind of cultural change and the importance of industry. So they have this energy charter where industry partners can be engaged in tackling affordability and this kind of cultural change that is needed. So kind of CEOs of energy firms, they sign up to this charter. They introduce an accountability framework where they kind of say, we're going to deal with energy affordability within our processes, and that actually works relatively well in Australia. And finally, there are also some interesting projects like the Our Power project in Australia that focus on these kind of the fact that people and communities should be the center of change. So a more kind of bottom-up approach to energy affordability to also ensure that values and visions of peoples and communities are included in the changes that are needed in energy system approaches. So this is just a very quick overview of the kind of things that we looked at in the EU and Australia. We have this this big overview, I think, that just covers some of the main elements that we discussed. We also included a kind of best practice overview of instruments and measures in the EU to tackle energy poverty. I didn't have time to go into these yet, but I think I want to draw out two key aspects. The fact that participation or market participation of vulnerable households is a much bigger issue in Australia than in most EU member states. And we also see that they're very good at engaging multiple actors. Just because it hasn't been so prominent on the policy or in the political landscape, you see different or other actors engaging with discussions on energy hardship. And now the final thing that I want to put up here is that we're still working together with these colleagues in Australia, and they want to push for a better understanding and inclusion of energy poverty in policy in national frameworks. And these are the kinds of questions that they've been asking us. And I think it would be a good opportunity to throw these back into the room as well, to see what we think are best practices, what have we learned from our approach to energy poverty in the EU or in individual countries that we can kind of give them. So I think the first question they have is a lot about indicators and about data. I think this is a discussion we had as well in the EU. Again, I think we've mentioned it previously. The question is, how important is an indicator? How important is a definition? I think there is a feeling that there is a need for some sort of national framework in Australia just to put the term and the issues on the map. But what do we really need the indicator for? What kind of monitoring do we think is really necessary? What do we think has worked at the EU level? And they were also very interested in these kind of questions of governance. So these overarching organizational bodies or measuring or bodies, the EPOV and the EPA, are very interesting to them because they're not directly coupled to kind of politics. They're not directly coupled to institutions, and they have this kind of overarching ability to drive forward these issues. But of course, we have different responsibilities at different scales. What makes sense at what scale? And of course, the final and the most important question is the question of policy, of the role that energy efficiency can play. I think pretty much all on the same page to say that energy efficiency is really important for long-term changes or long-term alleviation of energy poverty. But also, again, the question, what kind of indicators, what kind of definitions do we need? Do we really need for good policy to address energy poverty? So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Do we have questions from the audience?
Hi, Joel Franklin from Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. Very interesting and nice, very methodical comparison. Very nice. Thank you very much. My question is about kind of maybe toward the definition of energy poverty, because I think, especially reflecting on all three presentations, it seems there's kind of, we can gravitate more toward kind of more of a phenomenon around energy poverty that has more to do with structural barriers. But then in the winter that we're facing, like we're thinking, it comes to the fore that we're actually energy poverty, when defined more around expenditures on energy, could actually end up encompassing a much larger group. I wonder if, in looking at, for example, the Australian case with the volatility around closing a coal plant, and maybe did that kind of challenge the definition of energy poverty at all? Or on the other hand, you said you're going to review your results in light of the recent energy price surges. Has that also challenged, do you think, the definition of how you see energy poverty, or how you think Europe or Australia are kind of defining the concept of energy poverty?
I think in Australia, the price volatilities related to any changes in the electricity mix aren't actually discussed in terms of energy poverty or as directly as maybe they would be in the EU, because they're like, oh, this is a really bad change in the electricity markets, and all of these Greens, they want to close the coal plants, and this is just leading to really high prices, and we don't want this. So it's very much a kind of a mood against changes within the electricity markets, because experience has shown that the way that they've been done so far, that leads to higher prices. That's kind of also the media messaging. That's the kind of feeling within the major political party or the ruling political parties as well. So I think what is happening with the EU and in terms of then what's happening in the next winter, what I think is happening is actually that we're focusing a lot more on social policy related to energy poverty. So if we see higher prices, higher expenditures, a higher or larger group of households that will be affected or by energy poverty, if you will, then what we see in the responses from different states is that we're getting lump sum payments or rebates and anything like that, and the discussion isn't really about changes in we should have done energy efficient changes or changes to the housing stock ages ago, and then maybe we wouldn't be in this kind of bad situation. So I think the focus is focusing very specifically on short-term measures, short-term social policy, which I think is maybe also not incorrect, but it's important then to, I guess, not to miss this element of energy efficiency within dealing with energy poverty now that a different group is kind of affected by these high energy prices.
Is there also a question, please?
Thanks. Hi, thanks for the great presentation. My name is Johanna Kirkinen. I come from the Finnish Energy Authority. I would like to ask from the definitions that you said that in Australia you are talking about the energy hardship and stress. So are you planning to talk more about the poverty in the future? Because I'm just reflecting from the Finnish perspective, because sometimes it's hard to talk about these issues because poor have so kind of like negative, reflects quite negatively and nobody wants to be poor. So it's kind of like makes hard to talk about these issues, and moreover we have very extended social security. So sometimes I think now, especially with the high energy prices now during the winter time, it's going to be, so I was just thinking these words might be easier to talk about these issues, but what are you planning to do in the future to talk about these issues or poverty issues?
That's a very good question. I think a matter of wording isn't necessarily that important. I think if energy hardship is what's resonating within research, within policy, or within the kind of existing frameworks in Australia, then that's really the framework to build upon. I think trying to pivot all back to energy poverty and to try to subsume it in that way isn't really as relevant. But I'd also agree that talking about poverty, I think, is a very highly connotated term. And I think what we saw from Ute Dubois' presentation as well is that it's very hard for households households won't define themselves as poor. This doesn't happen. So I think the idea in Australia is to kind of work with what we have. And to try to build just upon more what we're doing in terms of the data or maybe indicators and in terms of policy. So I think the framing isn't actually as important. It's important to build upon the context that we have within a specific country.
Thank you. I think we don't have a discussion on the issue of governance. You mentioned governance. EPOV, it's an observatory, but it's not a policy implementer. So we can say it's part of the government, but the role of EPOV, it's very few. It just provides some information and some trainings. It will not change the things. So it's maybe something that was not clear to me. What is the governance in Australia, for instance, or if you consider there is no governance from what I have understood. So this is just it's not maybe a question, it's more a comment. We again discussed a lot of questions was around again definition. There is no question on governance, and as a policy implementer, this is the most important question. So still, as the audience, it's let's say oriented as academics to definition and issue. Even I understand that the definition I use impact on the way we work at how we design policies. But yeah, I think there were few dialogue on governance, and this is something maybe for the next conference to work more on governance. So if there is no other question,
Or maybe I can briefly respond
yes.
to that.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think I completely agree. I think to do a good policy to tackle energy poverty or to reach vulnerable groups, you don't need a big definition. You don't need a big indicator. You say, we don't actually see that in a lot of policy design. They say we're going to try to reach households by X, Y, or Z characteristic. And then that's kind of what they define as their group. I think what's interesting, or what our colleagues from Australia found interesting about EPOF, for example, obviously it didn't do any policy, but it did kind of put energy poverty on a map in a way that it wasn't before, or this was like the accumulation of a lot of work that had been done on energy poverty in the EU and more regionally. And that was interesting to them because it made groups or actors or policymakers that were previously not acquainted with the concept aware of it, and it kind of forced everybody to try to engage at least a little bit with the concept of energy poverty. So they were really interesting, kind of more from a lobbying perspective. What can an overarching body that kind of just defines or measures or monitors energy poverty in some way contribute to actual policy being targeted at those groups that we need to target? So I think this was the kind of interaction that they were interested in.
Okay, I don't know if a library make energy savings, but this is another story. Do they have a dedicated program for natives, Aborigine?
As far as I'm aware,
I suppose they are poor.
Yeah.
Some are poor.
Yeah. So we see there are some differences in their energy consumption patterns. So for example, pay-as-you-go services are very uncommon in Australia, except with First Nation communities. So it's kind of specific things that need to be addressed for this specific group, but there are no dedicated policies related to energy efficiency for that specific group, actually.
The last question for Jean-Sébastien. Do you have a micro, my friend?
Oh. That would be a question for the three speakers, actually, and that's going a bit beyond what you have presented, so that's not directly related to your presentation, but I'm quite curious about it, to know if you have done something about this question. That's about the equity and fairness in the energy efficiency policies overall. I explain myself. I know that there have been research, for example, in the topic of education, showing that more public money is given to the schools that are in richer neighborhoods, which just basically increase the inequities instead of reducing the inequities to put more money in the schools where the neighborhoods are poor. At least in France. I guess in Finland, probably that's different, and we wish we would have a more fair, let's say, a fair system in France. So did you look at that also for energy efficiency policies? So in terms, for example, of how much money per capita is offered or even distributed according to income deciles, for example? Because I got the questions from a colleague about what is done in France. I asked the question to your colleague at ADEME, Didier, and she realized that she was quite embarrassed not to be able to answer to that. So I would be curious to know if that's something that you have looked at.
I don't know if the other presenters have anything.
Well, I don't have much to answer because I think, well, I haven't seen this kind of systematic or, well, at the level of a country, a comparison of who gets what in terms of energy efficiency. It would definitely be interesting to do, but
I think it's more known for taxation. We always say that taxation is unequal, so I think it's documented. I have posed the question quite often: is a standard unequal policy or not? A building code or a standard for washing machine is the same issue for poor and rich. And so I have a personal views, but this is and standards are a classic policy, especially on developing country. So do we have to push standard or not? Do we consider it's reinforce inequalities and so on? You want to?
I was just asking, were you asking about school funding?
No, I was taking the example of school saying that there has been research on the topic of education to know if the public budget is used for education was distributed wisely. Basically, in France, that's one of the main reasons why we have one of the positive there, I do call it, system. Worse in that case, so we have super brilliant students in basically in the schools that are in these countries, like Polytechnic, etc. But then that's the next time. If you are born in a poor neighborhood, you have very few chances to make a
Maybe make my own personal view on sort of what we're seeing in the UK. Some of it around the energy efficiency investments are really about first come, first served. So who's actually in the right place with the right connections, with the right level of organisation to make use of the funding as it comes up. So it's probably very unequal. Can be quite London centric when we look at sort of distribution of funds within individual programmes. They're very, I think, I'll speak on behalf of Bayes because the chap's left the room, but Bayes are very conscious of not funding something that looks very London-centric when it's supposed to be UK-wide or England-wide funding programme around energy efficiency for low-income households. But inevitably, when you actually, so our organisation tends to run the competition on behalf of Bayes for these kind of programmes. I'd say a good 60% of the applicants are just there at the right time, with the right partnerships in place, just for as the funding comes out, which is not the best way to do it, but it's very hard to overcome that challenge.
So we are a little bit out of time, but the last remark from US.
I was just going to add that I work in California, and they have done research like that and shown that a lot of the energy efficiency subsidies have gone to wealthier homes, of course, and even the appliances that are most efficient are often bundled with a lot of other, a refrigerator that's efficient also has an ice maker and it's more expensive. So even just by accident, the wealthy will tend to get the rebates that don't need them. So the state of California often has said no more refrigerator rebates, and even on the solar, no more market rate solar subsidies. So they only now allow, you can only get a subsidy for solar panels on your roof if you're low income or you're in a disadvantaged neighborhood with a lot of pollution from, basically industry, or they're trying to do with transportation and solar, get into the multifamily and low income areas. So the policymakers have decided to make this shift, but it took many, many years. So.
But for subsidies, it's also known because mainly the rich can afford efficiency, so subsidies go to the rich. It's a classic. My issue is more on regulation because we are promoting more regulation, and I think with the climate change issue, we will go for, in the policy mix, more to obligations. So we have to think more on the role of obligation on the inequalities. Thank you for your participation. I hope it has been useful and fruitful, and I hope we will see you in the next Energy European Conference on Evaluation, and I hope with less poor, energy poor. Thank you. Bye-bye.